Tonight, before sleep wraps itself around you like a slow, heavy blanket, I want to take you somewhere very cold and very quiet. A place where winter does not simply arrive and leave politely, but settles in like a stubborn guest who refuses to move on. Because in the early days of the Wild West, when people talked about making it through the winter, they were not being dramatic. They were describing a season that could decide whether a family's story continued or ended in the snow. So before we step onto that frozen ground together, take a brief moment to gently like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, detailed nighttime storytelling. And if you want to help me sink even deeper into the sleepy atmosphere we build here, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now, so that in a way we are all sitting around the same invisible fire, spread across the world but sharing the same quiet moment. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders fall a little heavier, and follow me into the cold. You find yourself standing on ground that feels as hard as hammered iron, the kind of frozen earth that sends a dull ache up through your boots and into your legs. And in front of you lies not a town, not really even a village, but the beginning of something that hopes one day to be both. A scattered handful of cabins hunched against the wind, like tired shoulders under too much weight. The horizon is washed in pale colors, the sky a thin metallic blue that promises nothing kind, and every breath you take rises in front of you as a faint cloud, hanging in the air for a moment before dissolving into the deeper cold. This is not the West of movie posters and heroic poses. This is the first winter for the first settlers, when many cabins are only weeks old and nobody is entirely sure whether they will still be standing when the snow melts. Out here, winter is not a backdrop. It is an opponent. It pushes its way under doors, slides through gaps in the walls, creeps into shoes left by the hearth, and tests every decision these people have made in wood and sweat and hope. As you walk slowly toward the nearest cabin, you notice how quickly it was built, just from the way it leans, slightly crooked, as if it is still adjusting to being a house. The logs are rough and irregular, hacked into shape rather than carefully planed, stacked in a hurry because the first priority was not comfort or beauty, but simply something with a roof before the real cold arrives. Your hand brushes the outer wall, and you can feel the uneven joins between one log and the next. Thin seams that the wind loves to explore. The gaps have been stuffed with a crude mixture of mud, straw, bits of moss, and anything else that could be pushed into the cracks. In some places you catch sight of something stranger tucked into the chinking, scraps of worn-out cloth, an old sleeve, a torn apron, because when you are far from any store and the temperature is dropping, even ruined clothing becomes insulation. Historians still debate whether this habit came from older European folk practices or whether it simply emerged from desperate experimentation. But inside the cabin, nobody cares where the idea began. They only care that it makes the room a tiny bit less cruel at night. You lift the latch and push the heavy door inward, feeling its rough wood scrape reluctantly against the threshold, and a faint breath of warmth slips out to meet you. The kind of warmth that is more suggestion than reality, carrying with it the smell of smoke, boiled beans, damp wool, and people who work hard and do not always have enough water to spare for washing in winter. Your eyes take a moment to adjust to the dimness. The cabin is a single room, everything and everyone gathered into one space, because walls are expensive in labor and heat is hard to come by. So it is better to keep all life pressed together in a tight circle. The center of that circle is the hearth, where a small fire struggles along a bed of tired coals, doing its best to argue with the cold. Near the fire, someone sits half awake, wool blanket around their shoulders, poker in hand. Their head droops forward now and then, but they never quite let themselves fall fully asleep. Because if the fire dies completely in the middle of a winter night, every person in this room will pay for it with hours of shivering and maybe something worse. In many frontier families, tending the fire through the night was a shared duty. People took turns rising from their makeshift beds, poking at coals, adding logs, blowing gently on embers. It was more than a chore. It was the quiet, repetitive heartbeat of survival. You step further inside, and your boots land on a floor that isn't really a floor at all. Just packed earth, baked hard by footsteps and cold. The chill rises from it like an invisible mist, seeping into your feet and ankles, and it's easy to understand why settlers sometimes spread evergreen branches or straw across the ground, or laid old hides along the sleeping places. Anything to put just one more layer between their bodies and the frozen ground. The walls are still raw logs inside, darkened by smoke in places, sticky with sap in others, and here and there you can see the same patchwork chinking you saw outside, now dry and cracked and ready to crumble if the wrong piece is disturbed. From a few of the upper gaps a faint, brittle lace of frost has formed, tracing delicate patterns along the seams, proof that the cold doesn't just sit outside politely waiting to be kept out, but has already found its way in. In one corner, you notice a narrow platform low to the ground, made from rough planks laid across simple supports. On top of it is a heap of straw, not arranged like a modern mattress, but piled and shifted by bodies that lie there every night, turning the straw into uneven hills and valleys of comfort and discomfort. Spread over this is a heavy buffalo robe, the thick hide of a bison that once roamed the plains outside. When you touch it, you feel coarse fur under your fingers, slightly stiff with use, faintly smelling of smoke and tallow and animal fat. For settlers facing their first winters, a robe like this was more valuable than most pieces of furniture. Wool blankets were common, but in the deepest cold they often weren't enough by themselves, and many accounts describe people waking with frost on their hair and eyelashes, if they had nothing but thin quilts and woven covers. A buffalo robe, by contrast, could trap heat so effectively that on some nights, people woke sweating under its weight even while the air in the cabin remained bitterly cold. You are invited to sit down on the edge of this improvised bed, and as you lower yourself, the straw crunches under your weight, some stalks poking at your hips and shoulders, while others shift aside to form a new temporary shape around you. It is not comfortable in the way you know comfort, but it is better than the earth beneath it, and for many families that was the whole calculation, not luxury, not softness, just better than the ground. As you lie back carefully, stretching your legs, the buffalo hide is pulled over your chest, and its weight surprises you. It presses down with a firm, reassuring heaviness, like a warm sandbag, limiting your movement but at the same time sealing in the warmth your body begins to produce. The cabin air remains cold enough that each breath you exhale still fogs faintly in front of your face, but under the hide, a small pocket of warmth begins to form around your chest and arms, and you understand in a very physical way why people here did not measure comfort in softness, but in sheer dependable heat. Around you, life continues its quiet routines. Someone adds a small log to the fire, and the flames snap and complain before settling into a steadier glow. Shadows climb the walls, stretching and bending as the light shifts, creating the illusion of movement where there is only wood. In the opposite corner you can make out a child asleep on a pile of straw, wrapped in a quilt stitched together from old shirts and worn-out dresses. The pieces do not match. Some are faded, some still hold stubborn traces of colour, but together they form a blanket that is heavier and warmer than any one garment ever was. Quilts like these were common on the frontier, each one a private map of the family's past and present, sewn late into the night, while storms raged outside, and there was nothing to do but stitch, talk quietly, and hope the roof would hold. As you lie there, breathing slowly, you become aware of the cold rising from below, a slow, steady pressure that seeps through the straw and into your back. It is not the shocking cold of stepping barefoot on ice, but a deeper, more patient kind of chill, the kind that works its way into bones over hours. This is why settlers sometimes laid evergreen branches under their bedding or stacked extra hides beneath the straw, borrowing tricks from the indigenous peoples who had lived on this land long before cabins arrived. A thin layer of needles or extra skins could interrupt the climb of that earth cold, turning a miserable night into a tolerable one. Frontier diaries mention this kind of improvisation often, not as a clever survival hack, but as one more task on a list that never truly ended. The fire pops, sending a tiny spark up the chimney, and for a moment you hear nothing but the wind outside brushing its fingers along the roof. It moans and whistles as it finds small edges and gaps, sometimes sounding almost like a distant voice, sometimes fading into a low, constant hush. Somewhere far away a coyote howls, a thin sound on the night air, and then another replies, and for a brief moment you remember that outside this fragile cabin the land is vast and indifferent and full of lives that have nothing to do with yours. Inside, though, the room has shrunk to a circle of flickering light and breathing bodies, and your world consists of the rough tickle of fur against your chin, the smell of smoke in your hair, and the slow, subtle shift of the straw under you each time you move. It might surprise you to know that many settlers slept in almost all their clothes during winter, not just out of laziness or exhaustion, but because every layer of fabric acted as one more thin shield against the cold. Taking off boots and outer garments at night meant having to warm them again in the morning, and on some of the worst nights there was genuine risk in exposing skin for more than a few moments. So people lay down in their shirts, their trousers, their woolen socks, even their jackets, wrapping themselves in quilts and robes, until they looked less like individuals and more like a collection of bundled shapes lining the walls. Imagine this room at midnight, the fire dimmed to deep, glowing embers, the air so cold that everyone's breath hovers above their faces in small clouds, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder on narrow platforms of straw, boots still on, scarves still tied, hands tucked into sleeves or under hides to keep fingers from stiffening. Lying there on your back, eyes half open, you can almost hear the tiny sounds that would fill such a night. The occasional crack of a log shifting in the fire, the soft rustle of straw when someone turns over, a muffled cough from the corner, a sleepy murmur as a child kicks off a blanket and a parent tugs it back into place. Sometimes, to stay awake while tending the hearth, people hummed quietly to themselves or sang low, repetitive songs, barely louder than a whisper. There are old references to the idea that the fire likes a gentle voice, a small superstition suggesting that singing to it kept it alive, though it is hard to know now whether this was believed sincerely or simply used as a poetic excuse for lonely people to hear a human voice in the darkest hours. But whatever they believed, one thing was undeniably true. In cabins like this, sleep was never taken for granted. It was not a soft drifting into dreams on a perfectly even mattress, but a negotiated truce between tired bodies and a hostile season. You did not lie down expecting to be comfortable. You lay down hoping to be warm enough, long enough to wake up when the light returned, and as you feel the buffalo hide settle more completely over you, its edges tucked in around your shoulders, the cold pressing from below and the fire waging its quiet battle at your feet, you begin to understand that for early settlers in the Wild West, sleep during freezing winters was not just rest, it was an act of survival repeated every single night. You stay beneath the buffalo hide a little longer, feeling its weight settle around you like a silent guardian. And as your eyes drift toward the dim glow of the hearth, you sense the slow shift of the cabin as it contracts gently in the cold, wood tightening with soft pops and sighs that resemble a living creature, adjusting its old bones. The warmth from the fire barely reaches your feet, drifting toward you in uneven waves that fade before they truly arrive, and you begin to understand why early settlers never relied on a fireplace the way we might imagine. It was a companion, yes, but a stubborn and unreliable one, always demanding attention, always threatening to fade into darkness if someone dared to rest too deeply. You sit up slowly, the buffalo hide sliding off your shoulders with a soft thump, and as the cold wraps around your neck and settles along your spine, you feel the instinctive urge to curl back under the covers. But someone in the cabin gestures gently for you to follow, inviting you deeper into the rhythms of frontier winter life, and you rise, stepping carefully across the uneven floor where frost gathers in delicate patterns near the walls. When you reach the far side of the room, you see an object that looks deceptively simple at first. A large cloth sack, thick and pale, lumpy in places, tucked near the corner where the bedding piles together. The person beside you lifts it with a familiar ease and lets it drop, and you hear a soft whispering crunch inside. It is a feather tick, the closest thing many settlers ever had to a real mattress. You press your palm into it, and feel how the feathers shift, sliding away from your hand like drifting snow, creating pockets of resistance and sudden hollows. According to several old homemaking guides, settlers filled these ticks with any feathers they could collect: soft down plucked during butchering seasons, stiffer quills gathered from barnyard birds, even bits of dried grass added to stretch the supply. Over time, feathers clumped or poked through the fabric, and each night the mattress changed shape slightly, a living thing that required patience and continuous rearranging. Some families shook them every morning, children gripping opposite corners and snapping the tick briskly to fluff the filling, though whether this truly restored comfort or simply felt like an act of hope is something historians still debate. You lower yourself onto the tick and feel it dip unevenly beneath you, adjusting its shape with a soft rustling sound. The sensation is strangely soothing, the unpredictability of each shifting pocket reminding you that this bed has weathered countless nights of cold alongside its owners. You stretch your legs, letting the feathers redistribute themselves with a reluctant sigh, and imagine settlers lying here the same way, fully clothed, boots still tied, hands tucked under coats, bodies curled naturally toward one another for warmth. Every movement caused a ripple through the mattress, every shift of weight altering the terrain of sleep. Beside the tick sits a small basket, half filled with loose feathers. You scoop a few into your hand, feeling the contrast between the fluffier, cloud-soft down and the sharper quills that prickle your fingertips. A well-known domestic record mentions how families spent quiet winter evenings removing the stiffest quills from their bedding while seated near the fire, a slow, meditative task performed while listening to wind scrape against the roof. You return the feathers to the basket and run your hand along the tick once more, noticing spots where the seams bulge slightly, ready to release their contents into the room with the next careless tug. You lie back fully now, resting against the uneven surface, and stare up at the ceiling beams. Thin icicles cling to some of the edges, melting and refreezing throughout the night as the fire waxed and waned. Settlers often woke to frost forming on blankets, on hair, even on eyebrows, a strange glimmering crust that appeared whenever the fire dipped too low. Diaries from the era mention this phenomenon matter-of-factly, not as a dramatic detail but as a routine part of winter. "We woke with frost on the quilt again," one woman wrote, as though describing nothing more unusual than a change in the weather. The person beside you lifts a wool blanket, coarse, scratchy and heavy, and lays it across your legs. You feel its immediate pull of warmth, even as its fibers itch faintly against your skin. On the frontier, blankets rarely arrived as elegant matching sets. They were patched, repaired, overwashed, sometimes felted until stiff, yet each one held the faint scent of lanolin and smoke, a smell that clung to every garment and textile in winter cabins. You sniff softly and catch that familiar blend: wool, wood smoke, cold air, old fabric, a fragrance that seems to exist only in places where survival is the primary craft. The feather tick shifts again beneath you as you adjust your shoulders, sliding feathers to one side and making the opposite corner rise unexpectedly. You imagine a long winter night spent adjusting your position just so, learning the mattress quirks as if it had a personality. Some nights it would cradle your body in its hollows. On others it would push back at awkward angles, forcing you to rearrange it by hand in the dark. The fire pops loudly behind you, a sudden spark that startles you only because the rest of the room is so still. You turn your head and see someone adding a piece of wood to the hearth, coaxing new life into the flames. Orange light rolls across the floorboards and touches the edge of the feather tick, softening its rumpled shadows. For a moment the room feels warm enough to breathe deeply without flinching. but the warmth never lasts long. You sit up slowly, brushing stray feathers from your coat, and as your feet touch the cold earth again, the chill climbs instantly through your boots. The feather tick puffs back into its uneven shape behind you, as if preparing for its next occupant. And in that brief transition, from the imperfect comfort of the bed to the biting air of the cabin, you understand a truth the settlers knew well. Comfort was temporary. Warmth was borrowed, and every night was a negotiation with the season. You take a few steps away from the mattress, careful not to disturb the sleeping child across the room, and move toward the row of garments hanging on wooden pegs, the next layer of frontier nighttime survival. You step toward the row of garments hanging on the wooden pegs, and the closer you get, the more you understand why settlers spoke of clothing not as possessions but as tools, as armor, as the one barrier that did not collapse when the fire died low in the night. The garments sway slightly in a draft that sneaks through the gaps in the wall, each piece giving off its own faint scent of smoke, wool, and cold air. You reach out and lift a heavy wool shirt, stiff at the collar and coarse at the sleeves, still holding the memory of long days of labor. The fabric scratches lightly against your thumb, and you imagine wearing this to bed beneath 2 or 3 other layers, not for comfort but because warmth was something you wore, not something you expected the night to give you. In many frontier households, families slept in nearly every piece of clothing they owned. Children went to bed in thick socks, shirts, coats, sometimes even scarves wrapped around their necks. Adults slept wearing their trousers and jackets, because removing them meant facing 2 kinds of cold, the cold of the night and the cold of putting them back on in the morning when they had frozen slightly from the damp air. A widely referenced inventory list from the time explains that people often kept a bed coat or sleeping vest specifically for night use, an extra layer worn only in winter when the cold was at its most merciless. You picture settlers pulling these garments over their day clothes, adding layer upon layer until movement became slow and intentional, like wrapping oneself in a cocoon built from whatever scraps life could spare. You lift a patched skirt next, a thick woolen thing repaired so many times that no original seam remains. The patches overlap in uneven squares, darker fabric stitched over lighter, some fraying, some tightly woven. You hold it to your chest and feel the weight of it, heavy enough to block wind, stiff enough to trap heat. Many households used garments like these as extra bedding, laying them across legs, tucking them around shoulders, stacking them atop thin quilts to create a fortress of fabric that held warmth for as long as a body could generate it. On the peg beside it hangs a curious item, a canvas flour sack, cut and sewn into a crude hooded wrap. When you lift it, the fabric feels rough and cold, but durable. Some settlers repurposed every scrap available. Grain sacks became pillowcases, door coverings, makeshift blankets, even foot warmers. There are accounts of families wrapping their feet in cotton flour sacks before slipping them into boots at night, a simple gesture that could prevent numbness or frostbite when temperatures dropped dangerously close to zero. Whether this method was common or just one of countless improvised tricks is hard to determine, but in a cabin like this, with cold radiating up from the floor like an invisible tide, nothing seems unreasonable. You turn back toward the bedding and begin layering the garments onto it, as settlers would have done each evening. A wool blanket, then a quilt, then a hide, then another garment placed wherever a cold draft might slip in. Each layer makes the bed heavier, denser, almost nest-like. When you lower yourself onto it again, fully clothed this time, the combined weight presses down on you with a firm, insulating embrace. The air beneath the layers warms quickly, your own body heat rising and filling the small pocket of space around your chest. You inhale deeply and feel how the scent of wool and smoke settles into your lungs like a familiar winter lullaby. You shift your legs beneath the layers and feel how the garments fold and bunch in unpredictable ways. Thick socks catch slightly on the hide. The wool skirt bunches near your knee. The quilt slides a little with every movement, threatening to open a small draft that must be tucked back in immediately. Settlers learn to move slowly at night for this reason. not just to avoid waking those beside them, but to prevent the fragile balance of warmth from slipping away. Every shift of the body created new paths for cold air to sneak in, and every small adjustment became a negotiation between heat and stillness. You roll onto your side, and the layers fold around you like a cocoon. Wearing thick clothing to bed changes everything. Your skin never touches the bedding directly. You feel cloth against hide, and the rustling of fabric becomes a soft, continuous whisper in the darkness. Some frontier families wrote about how this rustling became one of the most comforting sounds of winter nights, a quiet, rhythmic chorus that meant everyone was still alive, still warm enough to move. You pull the top hide up to your chin and tuck your hands beneath it. The warmth builds quickly now, sealed in by the weight of all the layers. For a few moments you forget the cold entirely, but you know that if you uncovered your face even briefly, the air would bite sharply, enough to sting the nose, enough to make your breath bloom visibly in front of you. Many settlers slept with scarves or towels wrapped around their heads, leaving only a small opening for breathing. Others simply buried their faces beneath the blankets, trusting that the warmth would not escape too quickly. Your eyelids grow heavy for a moment, lulled by the thick weight of the bedding and the distant crackle of the fire. The warmth feels fragile, temporary, like something borrowed, and maybe that is why early settlers cherished it so deeply, because every night was a new battle, fought not with weapons but with layers, with breath, with bodies pressed close for survival. You sit up again, pulling yourself out of the cocoon, and the cold returns instantly, wrapping around your neck and clinging to your cheeks. The bedding behind you settles into a quiet heap, waiting patiently for nightfall, and as you stand adjusting your coat around your shoulders, you realize that warmth here is not something you receive. It is something you build, layer by layer, stitch by stitch, breath by breath. Now, as the afternoon light outside dims into the first silver hints of evening, you hear the wind shift again, brushing against the walls with a voice that says winter is nowhere near finished. And in this small cabin, with its uneven floor and its layers of patched clothing, the settlers prepare for another night. A night where every choice, every garment, every scrap of fabric could mean the difference between shivering and sleeping. You step away from the layered bedding slowly, feeling the cold coil around your ankles like a thin, restless creature that has been waiting for you to stand. The afternoon light outside has dimmed to that pale, silvery hue that settlers feared, the light that means the temperature is about to drop faster than the fire can rise. A faint rustle comes from the oiled cloth window covering, the fabric stiffening from the cold as it flutters inward with each push of wind. You cross the cabin, drawn by that sound, and rest your fingers lightly against the frame. The cold seeps instantly into your skin. Here, at this small square cut into the log wall, you find another battlefield of frontier nights. The window is nothing more than a hole in the cabin, sealed with fabric coated in oil or fat to make it somewhat weatherproof. But in winter, that cloth grows brittle, its edges curling just enough to let icy drafts slide inside. Some households pinned extra fabric around the frame at night. Others stuffed the edges with moss, rags, dried grass, whatever could be gathered before dark. A few frontier journals mention families pressing cattail fluff into window cracks because it acted like soft insulation, surprisingly effective despite its delicate nature. Whether this habit came from observing indigenous methods or was invented by necessity remains debated, but what you feel now, a blade-like chill slipping through the seams, explains perfectly why every scrap mattered. You draw the cloth tighter against the wall and listen. The wind has changed pitch, now a deeper, steadier hum that wraps around the cabin like a tightening rope. You hear faint thuds as loose snow smacks the logs outside. You imagine how quickly the world darkens once the sun sinks even a little further, the plains disappearing into one continuous sheet of blue-white night. Inside, the cabin seems to shrink, as though the walls huddle inward to escape the cold pressing against them. Someone moves near the hearth, stirring the fire from a gentle glow into something more willing to stand against the coming darkness. You turn toward them and watch sparks leap upward. briefly illuminating the room with brighter light. Then the flame steadies into a low burn, orange and patient, casting long shadows across the floor. You cross the cabin slowly, drawn once again to the fire's warmth, however fragile. You kneel beside it and extend your hands toward the flames. The heat licks your palms, spreading up your fingers in a relief so sharp it almost stings. And with that first wave of warmth comes another quiet truth. This fire must not die tonight. Not once, not even for a moment. Settlers treated nighttime firekeeping the way sailors treat a storm, something that requires vigilance, rhythm, and humility. You imagine the nightly routine, one person taking the first watch, then shaking another awake at a whisper when their eyelids grow heavy. Children learning early how to poke at embers just right, how to blow gently without scattering ash, how to place a new log so it catches flame instead of smothering it. Many families kept an ember box beside the hearth, a small wooden or clay container lined with ash, to preserve a single glowing coal until morning. If the fire died, that ember box could mean the difference between a few minutes of coaxing and an hour of freezing struggle. You sit on your heels and listen. The fire makes its small, brave noises, tiny pops, soft crackles, the tender hiss of sap dissolving. You feel its warmth on your cheeks, but notice how quickly that warmth fades once you lean back. The distance between fire and cold is only a matter of inches here. One step to the left, and the air bites your arm. 2 steps back and your breath fogs again. The fire brightens for a moment as a log shifts, then settles into a narrow flame. You watch it closely, imagining how many settlers stared at flames just like these, counting heartbeats between tasks, waiting for the next moment when tending was needed. Nights on the frontier weren't long, they were endless. The dark stretched for hours that felt heavier because every second carried weight, every spark mattered. Behind you, the bedding rustles as someone tests its warmth, then settles it again. The sound reminds you that soon, everyone in this room will lie under layers of hides and quilts, becoming silent shapes in a shared mound of fabric. You picture their breaths rising like small clouds in the cold, drifting just above their faces, glowing faintly in the firelight. You adjust your coat and turn toward the door. There, in the dimming light, you see the final ritual of the frontier winter night, deciding who will keep watch. You open the door just a crack. The cold rushes in with such force that you flinch. The horizon is turning to steel blue twilight, and snow dusts downward in slow drifting spirals. More wind, more cold, more night on the way. You close the door quickly and lean against it, feeling the wood shudder as a gust hits the outer planks. This is when settlers chose the night watcher, the person who would sit wrapped in heavy clothing near the fire, half dozing but never truly sleeping. Their task: keep the flame alive, listen for wolves, listen for wind, listen for anything that didn't belong in the dark. You imagine taking the first watch now. You picture yourself sitting beside the hearth as the others settle into their layered bedding. You would watch their breathing form little puffs of white in the darkness. You would hear muffled yawns, shifting quilts, the faint scrape of straw, then silence, and only the fire's dim glow to keep you company. You walk back toward the hearth, lowering yourself into the shadowy space where the night watch would sit. The fire glows softly, casting amber light over your hands. The cabin is growing colder as the last traces of daylight disappear. You tuck your feet beneath you, wrap your coat tighter around your shoulders, and let the rhythm of the fire become your rhythm. Soon the night will press hard against the walls. Soon the room will fall silent under blankets and breath, and you will sit here, listening to the winter breathe just beyond the door. You settle into the narrow space beside the hearth, the place where generations of exhausted settlers must have sat through nights just like this. Nights when the cold pressed its weight against the cabin as though trying to collapse the very idea of warmth. The fire glows weakly at first, a shy orange heartbeat pulsing in the dimness, and you cup your hands toward it, letting the heat crawl slowly into your fingers. Behind you, The cabin is beginning to fall into that deep evening stillness where every small sound becomes magnified. The soft shifting of straw as someone adjusts their bedding, the creak of logs expanding and contracting in the cold, the faint flutter of the oiled cloth window as wind tests its edges. You draw a slow breath and exhale into the cold cabin air, watching your breath lift like smoke. Soon the others will lie down to sleep. But the night watcher tonight, that is you, must remain alert. You can already sense the quiet weight of the responsibility, the knowledge that if your eyes close for too long, the fire could dim to embers and the cold would begin creeping across the room like a silent tide. The fire crackles weakly, and you lean forward to add a piece of kindling. The wood sizzles as frost melts from its bark, then catches flame with a soft fluttering sound. Frontier families developed an instinctive understanding of how to feed a fire. Too much wood too quickly, and it would choke. Too little, and it would fade. But just the right piece at just the right moment could keep the cabin alive. You blow gently on the embers, your breath coaxing a deeper glow from the coals, and watch the flame stretch taller for a moment before settling back into its steady rhythm. Behind you, bedding rustles softly as the family prepares for sleep. You picture them layering quilt over quilt, pulling hides tight around their shoulders, sliding cold feet against someone else's warm legs. Soon there will be no movement in the cabin except the slow rise and fall of sleeping chests, the occasional groan of the wooden frame beneath them, the faint mutter of someone drifting through a dream. As night deepens, those sounds will fade into an almost sacred quiet, the kind of silence you only hear when survival depends on not disturbing it. The oiled cloth window flickers again. Outside, the wind has changed tone. It is deeper now, more hollow, brushing against the logs with long, steady strokes. It sounds like distant breathing, like something enormous out on the plains, inhaling and exhaling with slow patience. You tilt your head, listening closely, not for wolves, though their howls sometimes spiraled through these nights like lonely prayers, not for riders or travelers either, because in winter nobody crossed the darkness unless something had gone badly wrong. You listen instead for the rhythm of the storm, whether the snow is thickening, whether the wind is shifting direction, whether the cold is preparing something harsher before morning. You reach for a thick wool coat hanging nearby, the one the night watcher keeps close. When you drape it over your shoulders, the weight is noticeable, almost comforting. Frontier letters often describe how the person tending the fire felt the cold more intensely than anyone else. While the sleepers shared warmth under the hides, the watcher sat half in shadow, half in the fire's unpredictable glow, alternating between feeling too hot near the flames and too cold each time they leaned back. You already sense that contrast, a warm cheek, a cold shoulder, fingers that sting when near the fire and ache when pulled away. In the far corner, the feather tick makes a muffled sigh as someone settles into it. You glance over and see the shapes of bodies becoming still beneath the layers of blankets, like small hills rising and falling with each breath. Soon the entire cabin will dim into a soft, slow heartbeat of sleeping people, and in that heartbeat, the fire becomes the only thing awake besides you. You poke the embers again, watching sparks dance upward in tiny arcs, each one a brief star that burns out before it can reach the chimney. The chimney itself leans slightly to one side, gaps between stones revealing slender slivers of moonlight. Whenever the wind blows sharply, a thread of cold air slips down through those gaps, making the fire flutter sideways. You instinctively block the draft with your body, just as settlers did, using your own shape as a shield for the flame. Time moves strangely here. Minutes stretch long and thin, as though the cold slows the very movement of hours. Your eyes grow heavy, and you shift your weight to stay awake. You rub your hands together, listening to the dry scrape of wool on wool. Somewhere behind you, someone murmurs in their sleep, and then falls silent again. You imagine the world outside, a vast, white silence stretching endlessly in every direction. Snow gathering in soft drifts along the cabin walls, the sky a deep indigo bowl, cloudless and distant. Perhaps a lone coyote padding silently across the frozen ground, Perhaps nothing at all except wind moving over an empty plain. You lean closer to the fire once more. The flames respond with a new flicker of light that climbs the walls, revealing the uneven textures of the interior, cracked chinking knots in the wood, a line of dried herbs hanging from a beam. Everything in the cabin is worn, patched, fragile, but it all feels purposeful in this moment, as though every crack and seam is part of a larger story. You add another piece of wood and watch it settle. The flame embraces it, then folds around it slowly. This is the rhythm of the night. Tend, watch, breathe, listen, and somewhere beyond the darkness dawn waits, far away yet inevitable. But for now, the night belongs to you and the fire. The fire settles into a long, low burn, and as you sit beside it, the cabin around you begins to sink into the deepest part of the night. That strange, suspended hours when time feels thinner, when the world outside the walls becomes nothing but darkness and wind, and when every sleeper, wrapped in quilts and hides, drifts into a silence so complete that you can hear the soft pulse of your own breath. You shift closer to the hearth, feeling the uneven warmth kiss your knees while the cold clings to your back like a second unwanted coat. The logs in the fire glow red at their centers, a dark, smouldering crimson like the color of a sunset that could never reach the plains. You listen to the night the way settlers once did, attentive, alert, aware that the world changes character after sundown. The wind no longer skitters playfully across the prairies. It drags itself heavily against the cabin, long, slow gusts that sound almost like words mouthed by an unseen speaker. At times, when the gusts drop suddenly, the silence is so absolute that your heartbeat becomes the loudest thing in the room. And then the wind returns, brushing the roof, rattling the leather hinges on the door, squeezing itself through seams like an impatient visitor. The sleepers behind you breathe in soft, irregular rhythms, a muffled cough, a shift in the straw, a quilt being pulled higher. All of it feels like the natural, living soundscape of a frontier night. You glance over your shoulder and see their shapes curled beneath layers of fabric, motionless except for the rise and fall of their chests. Their warmth is tucked beneath hides and wool. Yours must come from fire. You tighten the coat around your shoulders and tuck your hands under your arms for a moment. The fire's heat fades quickly whenever you lean away, and you understand in a very physical way why the night watcher often fought against sleep more fiercely than any animal outside. Staying awake was not a matter of discipline alone, it was a matter of temperature. If you allowed yourself to drift too deeply into rest, your body would cool, your circulation would slow, and the fire, already shrinking hour by hour, would slip into a tired red hush. You hear a faint sound outside, not wind this time, something sharper, more curious, a quick brittle crack, like ice fracturing, or a twig breaking under a cautious step. Your breath holds. You look toward the door, the lantern beside it remains unlit, and the oiled cloth window offers no clarity about the world beyond. The plains at night can be deceptively alive. Sometimes it's a fox or a deer stepping lightly through snow. Sometimes it's a coyote nosing around for scraps. Settlers wrote often of hearing footsteps outside and holding their breath, not out of fear of attack, but because every sound felt magnified, as though the dark itself were listening. You hold still for several seconds, ears straining. Nothing. Then another faint crack, farther away. You let your shoulders ease down again, understanding that on nights like this, the world outside is always shifting and settling. Snow drifts collapse under their own weight. Tree branches, if any survive in this sparse region, shed frost. The ice on shallow creeks groans like a sleeping creature. The frontier has its own language after dark, and you are just beginning to understand its vocabulary. You return your attention to the fire. Its flame dips low, stretching thin like a tired dancer bowing toward the coals. You take a small branch of kindling and place it gently across the embers. The wood blackens at the edges, then curls, then finally catches with a faint hiss. You lean forward to blow softly, your breath coaxing bright orange veins from the murk. The flame grows, but only slightly. You add another piece, larger this time, and feel relief when the fire responds with a stronger flicker. A sudden draft sweeps across the room, making your hair shift. For a moment the fire bends away from you, its flame drawn sideways by the cold air sneaking through the chinking. You angle your body to block the draft, using your own warmth as a shield. Family letters from this era mention watchers doing exactly this, moving like slow, sleepy sentinels around the hearth, bending themselves into awkward shapes just to keep a log lit a little longer. The fire stabilizes, burning steadily now. You sit again, stretching your legs toward the warmth. The soles of your boots begin to thaw, the cold leather softening slightly, and you revel in that subtle comfort. Warm feet meant better endurance. Cold feet meant a long, difficult night. Your eyelids grow heavy for a moment. You blink hard. Many settlers described this exact sensation. How the hypnotic glow of the fire, combined with the endless quiet, lulled even the strongest watchers into dangerous drowsiness. Some hummed low songs to stay awake. Others whispered prayers. A few walked small circles around the cabin to keep blood flowing. One old diary even mentions a woman who pinched her earlobes whenever she began to nod off. "My ears will keep me alive tonight," she wrote with weary humor. You straighten your back and inhale slowly, letting the cold air fill your lungs before releasing it into the faint orange halo of the room. You reach for the kettle resting near the hearth and tilt it gently. Warm water pools into a cup, metal dented, shaped by hand, its steam rising in thin white spirals. The warmth helps keep your focus sharp. You sip slowly, savoring the way heat moves down your chest like a ribbon of light. The night stretches deeper. The world grows quieter. The fire sip's glow becomes more precious with each passing minute. And in the silence, a realization settles. You are holding the night together with nothing but attention and fire. You glance at the sleeping forms behind you. You imagine them stirring if the temperature dropped, tucking themselves tighter into their cocoon of quilts. You imagine their breath frosting the air. You imagine the fire dimming, the cold creeping closer, the quiet turning dangerous. But not yet. Not on your watch. The night deepens into that pale, formless hour when even the wind seems to hesitate, as though deciding whether to continue its assault or grant the cabin a brief, fragile mercy. You sit closer to the fire now, not because it is warmer, but because it is fading. Its glow has shrunk to a narrow cradle of embers, each coal a tiny sunken star pulsing irregularly, fighting exhaustion the same way you are. This is the hour settlers feared. Not midnight, not dusk, but the hour before dawn, the coldest point in the entire night, when heat drains from the world like breath from a dying ember. You lean in and feel almost no warmth on your face. The embers crackle weakly, their sound thin and brittle. Behind you, the sleepers shift under their hides and quilts. A soft groan, a rustle, the sound of someone instinctively pulling their knees closer to their chest. These tiny movements tell you everything. The room is growing colder than before. The warmth trapped under layers is being slowly stolen away, leaf by leaf, degree by degree, by a night that does not forgive anyone who lets their guard fall. You reach for the woodpile. The logs are cold, coated with a fine dusting of frost along their edges. When you touch one, your fingers sting as though you've plunged them into icy water. You choose a piece and carry it to the hearth. The coals resist at first, glowing dimly as though too tired to rise. You break off a few small splinters from the log, tender, curling shavings, and lay them gently across the embers. You blow softly. Nothing. You blow again. Longer this time, your breath warm against the ash. A faint orange thread flickers to life. You blow once more. The thread thickens. A spark leaps. Then another. Frontier diaries mention these moments with startling honesty. Some nights, settlers tended a dying fire with such desperation that their hands blistered from working too close to heat or froze from working too far from it. Others wrote of crying quietly from relief when flames caught again. A few recorded the opposite, the terrible morning when the hearth had turned cold and black, and rebuilding warmth required an hour of numb-fingered effort in freezing air. You add a twig. It smoulders, takes flame, then folds into a small, reluctant curl of light. You add the bigger log. The fire hesitates, then slowly, painfully accepts it. A breath of heat touches your cheek. Not much, but enough to stir hope. You sit back and wrap your coat tightly around your chest. The fire grows with agonizing slowness, but it grows, smoke spirals upward, catching along the uneven stones of the chimney before slipping into the dark beyond. You lift your cup of warm water again, though it has cooled, and drink it anyway. Even a little warmth is precious now. Behind you, someone sighs in their sleep. Long, low, relieved. They can feel the change in temperature even through layers of wool and hide. You glance over at them, the faint firelight flickering across their bundled forms. Children nestled between parents to create a warm core. Adults curled like question marks under quilts. A dog lying at someone's feet. Its body curled tight, breath rising in thin puffs. Even the dog's presence is part of the strategy. Settlers knew that body heat from any living creature was worth keeping near. You stand for a moment to chase stiffness from your legs. The cold bites your knees instantly. Frost has begun forming along the lower edges of the walls, tiny crystalline webs of ice shimmering faintly in the firelight. If you touch them, they will melt into droplets that freeze again moments later. You see your breath rise in long, steady clouds. Every inhale feels like pulling winter straight into your lungs. This is the hour that breaks the unprepared. You return to the fire and poke gently at the glowing log. Sparks jump up, swirling like tiny fireflies before disappearing into the chimney. The flames strengthen, licking at the wood with renewed hunger. The heat spreads gradually, slow but undeniable. You feel it in your palms first, then your forearms, then across your chest. The worst part of the night is beginning to pass. But dawn is still far from guaranteed here. The cold will not loosen its grip without another test. Settlers knew this intimately. Many wrote that the final 2 hours of darkness felt longer than the entire day that followed. It was a psychological cold as much as a physical one. A cold that waited, pressed, whispered that maybe the sun would not come, maybe the wind would stay, maybe the fire would fail one last time. You settle back into your post, pulling the coat across your knees, feeling the fire's warmth slowly seep into your bones with each minute. Outside, the wind shifts again. The tone changes, higher, thinner, almost hesitant. Snow brushes lightly against the roof. Somewhere beyond the cabin, an animal calls once, then falls silent. Inside, the cabin breathes. The fire breathes. And you, weary but awake, breathe with them. The night is still deep, but its edge is beginning to fray. You sit motionless for a moment, listening to the fire gather its strength again, feeling the faint warmth radiate outward in slow, uneven pulses. And as the cabin begins to shift around you with soft creaks of expanding wood, and the restless sighs of sleeping bodies adjusting under heavy quilts, you realize that the long night is finally beginning to loosen its grip. Even though the world outside remains buried in darkness so thick it feels almost tactile, like velvet pressed against the windows, yet somewhere behind that darkness the sky is inching toward dawn, and although no light has appeared, there is a subtle change in the air, a barely perceptible thinning of the cold, as if the night has taken its deepest breath and is now preparing to release it. You lean closer to the fire, feeding another small piece of wood into the center of the glowing embers, watching with a quiet, exhausted kind of hope as the flame hesitates, curls inward, then slowly unfurls itself into a small, determined bloom of orange that illuminates your hands and the rough lines of the hearthstones. And as the flame steadies, you allow your shoulders to relax, feeling the tension slip from your spine in a long wave. because you know instinctively that the worst hour has passed, that this tiny flame has carried you through the coldest test of the night, and that no matter how fiercely winter still claws at the cabin walls, morning is moving toward you one quiet inch at a time. Behind you, the bundled sleepers begin to stir in the shallow, half-conscious ways people do when the night has been long, and the cold has pressed too hard for too many hours. Someone shifts in the straw, generating a muffled crackle beneath their weight. A child curls deeper into the hollow formed between two adults, and the dog at their feet lifts its head only long enough to stretch before sinking back into the warmth. And all these subtle movements create a living tapestry of sound that blends with the gentle snapping of the fire and the fading moan of the wind outside, forming an atmosphere that feels strangely intimate, as though the entire cabin is exhaling together after a shared trial. You push yourself to your feet, slow and stiff at first, feeling the blood return to your legs with a tingling ache, and as you stand, you take in the room from a new angle, the frost lining the lower walls like thin lace sculpted by breath, the quilts piled unevenly atop feather ticks and straw beds, the hanging garments swaying ever so slightly in the draught, the thin tendrils of smoke snaking up the chimney stones, and you understand how every object here, every stitch and seam, every scrap of cloth or patch of moss, has played a role in keeping the night survivable. You move toward the oiled cloth window, noticing that its surface has shifted from the deep, opaque blackness of midnight to a softer, more diluted darkness, a shade that holds just the faintest suggestion of blue. And when you lift a hand toward it, you find that the fabric is still stiff with cold, but no longer brittle enough to snap at the edges, a small but undeniable sign that the world outside is changing, even if your eyes cannot yet see it. And as you hold your hand there, palm hovering above the cold air that slips through the seams, you feel the first subtle thread of dawn whispering against your skin. You return to the fire and crouch beside it, letting the warmth settle into your knees, and you think about how many settlers must have experienced this exact moment, the moment when the terror of the cold night began to lift, but the responsibilities of the coming day had not yet begun. The moment suspended between survival and labor, between relief and duty, where everything is still quiet and the world is still asleep, and you alone hold witness to the turning of darkness into light. You glance again at the sleepers and imagine them waking soon, groggy but grateful, rubbing frost from their eyelashes, pulling boots onto stiff feet, feeding children warm water or thin porridge made from yesterday's leftovers, stoking the fire to full flame, now that sunlight is approaching to help with the warmth, and stepping outside into a landscape reshaped by the night, where snow has gathered into new drifts, where footprints from the previous evening have become faint craters, where the horizon stretches endless and white beneath a slowly brightening sky. And in this moment, sitting here with the fire breathing softly beside you, the cold thinning around the cabin, and dawn preparing to rise over a world built on grit and endurance, you understand something profound about the early settlers, that their strength was not merely in facing storms or building cabins or crossing impossible distances, but in surviving nights exactly like this one, nights when warmth was a fragile thing held together by hands that refused to let the flame die, nights when survival was measured in embers and breaths and quiet hours passed in patience. The faint shift in the window's darkness slowly deepens into something more distinct, a muted grey-blue that spreads almost imperceptibly across the oiled cloth. And as you watch this quiet transformation, you sense how dawn approaches not with a single burst of light, but with a slow, cautious seepage that gently pushes back the night. And the room responds in subtle ways. The cold grows less aggressive, the shadows soften along the beams, and even the fire seems to burn with a steadier confidence, as though reassured by the promise of daylight waiting beyond the horizon. You rise from your crouched position near the hearth, joints stiff but relieved, and turn once more to observe the sleeping figures whose breath hovers like pale ribbons in the thinning chill, their bodies curled instinctively into the warmth they created together, unaware that the hardest hour has now slipped behind them. You step carefully across the packed earth floor, feeling how the air has changed, no longer stabbing sharply at your cheeks, but settling instead into a gentler, more tolerable cold that carries the faint scent of morning, a scent that is difficult to name but unmistakable in its presence, like frost preparing to release its grip or snow, quietly surrendering to a promise of sun. You pause near the bedding and see the first stirrings of wakefulness, a hand shifting beneath a quilt, a leg stretching against a hide, a child mumbling softly in the half-conscious space between dreaming and waking. And all of these small movements strike you with a sense of quiet resilience, because these people have endured another night in conditions that would leave modern comfort seekers overwhelmed after only minutes. The fire crackles more boldly now as you add another log, the flame curling eagerly around its edges, sending a warm orange glow across the interior of the cabin. You imagine the relief this brings, not just in temperature but in spirit, because settlers wrote often about how dawn itself uplifted the mind, how surviving the night gave them a fresh, almost defiant energy to face whatever tasks awaited, and it becomes clear why mornings were treasured on the frontier. Each one represented not merely a passage of time but a victory, a confirmation that their shelter, their efforts, and their stubborn will had succeeded against the harshest opponent they knew. As you turn toward the door, the cold wood beneath your hand no longer shocks your skin. Instead, it feels manageable, something you can face rather than fear. And when you crack the door open by a few inches, the cabin fills with a rush of air that carries a different character than the night wind, lighter and less biting, scented faintly with snow and distant sunlight. The horizon outside remains dim, but you see the beginnings of a pale brightness edging across the world, casting a soft silver sheen on the frozen ground and outlining the rough shapes of nearby cabins that crouch in their own morning silence, each one a testament to the endurance of the families who built them. You slip outside for a moment, boots sinking slightly into the crust of snow that formed during the night, and as you breathe in the icy air, your chest tightens pleasantly, as though the cold is no longer an enemy but a stern teacher whose lesson you have finally understood. The settlement is still asleep, with only a thin plume of smoke rising from one distant chimney, yet you feel the invisible stirring of life preparing to awaken, horses shifting in their shelters, chickens scratching beneath thin layers of straw, and the soft, rhythmic creaking of a nearby cabin door as another early riser tests the air. You step back inside and close the door gently, and in the warm dimness you find that the sleepers have begun to wake more fully. Someone lifts their head, blinking through the remnants of frost on their eyelashes, then tucks the blanket closer as they swing their legs toward the floor. Another person stirs on the straw, brushing bits of dried grass from their coat as they sit upright. A child emerges from beneath a quilt with the heavy, sleepy weariness of someone unaccustomed to waking in such sharp cold. Yet even through their drowsiness there is a resigned acceptance that this is simply another morning in a long season of difficult mornings. The firelight reflects softly on their faces, highlighting the raw, tired beauty of people who have learned to meet each day with quiet determination. And as you watch them rise, you feel the room warm, not only in temperature but in spirit, an unspoken acknowledgement moving among them that the night is over. They are still here, and that simple truth is enough to begin whatever comes next. You help adjust one of the quilts, lifting it so the straw beneath can be fluffed, and you notice how the bedding retains a faint warmth from the clustered bodies, warmth that evaporates quickly into the cooling air, but lingers long enough to remind you how essential shared heat has been for survival. Settlers often spoke of these brief moments when blankets were lifted and steam drifted upward, evidence of how fiercely the cold had pressed against them all night. Someone moves toward the kettle above the fire, lifting it carefully and pouring warm water into a tin cup, then handing it across the room to a child who wraps small hands around it with visible relief. You understand then how mornings began here, with simple gestures, slow awakenings, and the rebuilding of warmth not just through fire but through companionship, routine, and the steadfast belief that if they could endure last night, they could endure the one that came next. And as the cabin fills with these subtle stirrings of life, faint conversation, the rustle of wool clothing being pulled on, the soft dragging of boots across the earth floor, you sense that the day ahead will be defined not by ease but by persistence, because this is a world where survival is a daily craft, shaped by hands that know how to endure cold, scarcity and solitude without surrender. As the cabin brightens slowly with the hesitant light of early morning, you watch the settlers begin their quiet rituals of waking, each movement slow and deliberate, not because they lack energy, but because the cold forces every gesture to be measured, controlled, almost ceremonial. They rise from their bedding as though peeling themselves from the very night, brushing off straw and shaking out stiff quilts, and the steam that rises briefly from the places where bodies once lay hangs in the air like a delicate veil before disappearing into the thinning chill. You notice how no one rushes morning on the frontier, is not a race but an act of steady rebuilding, a reclaiming of warmth and order after hours spent in darkness. One of the adults kneels near the hearth and stirs the fire with practiced patience, turning the larger log so its glowing underbelly faces upward, feeding it new shavings, coaxing the flame until it reaches the point where it no longer doubts itself. As the fire strengthens, the room shifts with it, shadows drawing back from the corners, quilts revealing more color, faces gaining depth and softness that were hidden by the night. The smell of warm ash rises faintly, mixing with the scent of wool and the earthy tang of the floor, creating an aroma that settlers knew as intimately as breath itself, an aroma that meant safety, survival, and the beginning of another day. You watch someone fetch a wooden bucket from near the door, lifting it carefully because the rim has frozen overnight, and the water inside carries a thin jacket of ice that cracks like delicate glass when touched. They hold it near the fire to soften the surface, then break it with the back of a spoon, the sound echoing lightly through the cabin. A cupful of this water is poured into a pot already sitting in the hearth's glow, mixing with leftover beans or grain from the night before, because nothing is wasted in a place where supplies must last through months of cold, and breakfast is less a meal than a continuation of yesterday's sustenance. Outside, the light grows slightly stronger, revealing more details through the oiled cloth, pale streaks of gold brushing the tops of snowdrifts, a faint shimmer across the frozen ground, and a thin line of smoke rising from a neighboring cabin, telling you that another family has survived the night's bitterness. You step to the door and open it just enough to let a sliver of dawn enter. The air that slips in is still sharp, still holding the memory of the night. But there is a gentler quality to it, as though the world is breathing more evenly now that daylight has returned. You watch as a man steps outside in his heavy coat, shoulders hunched against the cold but movements sure and steady. He checks the small shed where the animals are kept, brushing frost from the latch, listening to the tired snorts of a horse shifting its weight, knowing that tending to animals cannot wait, no matter how unforgiving the weather has been. On the frontier, morning chores are not tasks but obligations woven into life. Fetching water before the sun softens the ice too much, checking traps laid the day before, stepping into snow to inspect firewood piles, shaking loose branches so the weight of snow does not snap them before they can be used. When you close the door again, the cabin feels warmer, not because the temperature has changed dramatically, but because the people inside have begun to fill it with life. A woman tying a scarf around her neck while smoothing her child's hair, a young boy rubbing warmth into his hands before slipping them into mittens that smell faintly of smoke, an older man stretching his back with a tired groan that suggests strength built from years of resisting the cold. These gestures, ordinary as they seem, form the heart of frontier mornings, a choreography shaped by necessity repeated daily across countless winters. Someone ladles a portion of warm porridge into a cup and hands it to you. The heat radiates through the metal and into your palms, spreading a slow, blooming comfort through your fingers and chest. As you sip, the warmth settles inside you like a small fire taking hold, and you understand why even thin, simple food meant more in winter, because it wasn't just nourishment, it was a reminder that the day could be endured. The conversation in the cabin remains soft, almost whispered, as though the morning itself requires a gentler tone. People speak of how the wind changed during the night, of how the fire nearly faltered, of how tomorrow they must gather more wood from a stand of trees to the east before the next storm arrives. These discussions are not dramatic or fearful. They are practical, grounded, spoken with the calm acceptance of people who have learned to negotiate with winter rather than fight it. As you finish your cup, the fire crackles brightly enough to send a faint golden shimmer across the ceiling beams, and you feel the cabin truly awaken for the first time since dusk. It is as though the structure itself exhales, shaking off frost in slow, invisible breaths, preparing to resume its role not just as a home but as a shield against a season that never fully relents. And in that moment, as morning settles fully over the frozen settlement and each person prepares for the long tasks ahead, you understand that survival on the frontier is not defined by heroic acts or single triumphs, but by this quiet daily resilience, by mornings reclaimed from bitter nights, by fires coaxed from dying embers, by hands that rise again and again to greet a cold that does not stop coming, but can always, through patience and stubbornness, be met. Morning unfolds slowly across the settlement, not in a burst of brightness, but in a gentle, creeping illumination that reveals the true shape of everything the night concealed. And as you step outside with the settlers, you feel how the cold has changed its temperament. It no longer bites savagely, but holds steady, firm and unyielding, like a hand resting on your shoulder, reminding you that winter still rules the day with quiet authority. The snow beneath your boots crunches in a crisp, rhythmic way, each step sinking slightly into the powder that formed overnight, and the landscape stretches outward in a vast white silence that seems almost sacred after the long hours of darkness. A silence broken only by the soft whinny of a horse being led from its shelter, or the distant thud of an axe striking wood. You follow one of the men toward the wood pile, a rough, uneven stack of logs that has diminished noticeably since the start of the season, and as he hefts his axe and sets another log upright in the snow, you understand how essential this simple chore is. Cutting wood is not merely gathering fuel, it is building time, purchasing hours of warmth, shaping the length and comfort of the coming night. Each log split means another stretch of survivable darkness, another pocket of heat that can be counted on when the fire begins to falter. The axe rises and falls in long, measured strokes, the sound echoing across the cold morning air, and chips of frozen wood scatter like shards of pale glass with each impact, catching the faint sunlight in brief flashes. Nearby, another settler pours frozen feed into a wooden trough, tapping the sides to break apart the stiff clumps, while the animals gather with visible relief, their breath rising in soft grey plumes. The horses nuzzle the hay, shifting their hooves in the snow, while a pair of thin cows stand close together for warmth, their hides glossy with frost along the spine. Caring for livestock in winter is not an option, but an obligation, for these animals represent food, labor, transportation, and survival, and every dawn begins with ensuring their endurance, because without them the coming months would become nearly impossible. A woman steps outside carrying a small iron pot, empty now after the morning porridge, and she kneels beside a narrow opening in the frozen creek, using a stick to clear ice from the surface. Settlers often carved such holes in winter, returning daily to keep them from sealing shut, because access to water, even icy water, meant the difference between ease and hardship for the entire household. Her breath fogs the air as she works, and the rhythmic clink of her stick on the ice blends with the distant ring of the axe, creating a kind of frontier music, a melody shaped by necessity rather than artistry. As you watch her fill the pot, you glance back toward the cabin, now glowing faintly with the steady fire inside, and you recognize how every part of daily life here revolves around maintaining a delicate balance between warmth and exposure. Every trip outside is calculated, every task timed, every effort directed toward ensuring the cabin remains a barrier against the cold for one more night. The settlers move with purposeful care. There is no wasted motion, no unnecessary chatter, no moment when they forget that winter demands constant respect. When you return inside, brushing snow from your boots against the threshold, the cabin welcomes you with a warmth far more noticeable than earlier. The fire now burning brightly enough to cast a firm light across the walls. One of the quilts has been hung near the door to block drafts, and you feel the faint resistance of the fabric as you pass it, a reminder that settlers often created small barriers within the cabin to trap heat, dividing spaces not by walls but by layered textiles and clever positioning. You notice someone repairing a pair of wool socks near the hearth, needle moving steadily through thick fabric with quiet determination, and beside them lies a stack of garments, mittens, scarves, patches of old cloth, waiting their turn for mending. Winter does not tolerate frayed seams or holes in clothing, and settlers knew that every stitch sewn during daylight saved them from a gnawing chill in the night, so clothing repair became as essential as chopping wood or tending animals. The air inside carries the deep, soothing scent of smoke and warm wool, blending with the faint aroma of boiled grain still clinging to the pot, and as the settlers speak among themselves in low voices, you sense how the cabin has shifted from a place of nighttime endurance to a center of daytime strategy, a place where plans are formed and responsibilities divided. Who will gather more firewood? Who will check the traps? Who will mend tools? Who will fetch water or grind grain or sweep straw into fresh piles for tonight's bedding? You sit near the fire, letting its heat thaw the last traces of cold from your knuckles, and as you watch light creep gently across the interior from the straw-filled corners to the lines of chinking between logs, you realize how profoundly morning changes the frontier world. The dangers of the night have lifted, the desperation replaced with resilience, and though the day will be filled with labor, and the cold will never fully retreat, there is an undeniable sense of quiet triumph in the air, a recognition that winter has been met once again and held at bay. The settlers move through these routines, not with complaint, but with a kind of quiet pride, knowing that each action, splitting a log, patching a sleeve, stirring the hearth, represents one more step in a long chain of tasks that keep life possible. Survival here is not dramatic or sudden, but slow, cumulative, built from 1,000 small decisions repeated every day until spring finally arrives. As the morning steadies into full light and the cabin settles into its daytime rhythm, you notice how every person moves through the space with quiet purpose, aware that the day may be brighter than the night, but never truly easier, because winter on the frontier does not relent simply because the sun has risen. Instead, it becomes a different kind of adversary, one that governs every choice the settlers make, from how long the fire may be left unattended to how far from the cabin anyone dares to walk in search of wood, food, or shelter for the animals. You watch the way the light filters through the oiled cloth window, turning the room a muted amber, warm in appearance but misleading in sensation, because the air still presses against your skin with a steady cold that reminds you not to be fooled by the sun's pale disguise. One of the settlers moves toward a crack between two logs where the chinking has begun to crumble, the night's frost widening the seam just enough to let thin spears of cold air slip inside. You see him press his fingers against it, feeling the invisible draft before reaching for a small basket of patching materials, bits of dried moss, handfuls of straw, scraps of torn cloth, and he packs them firmly into the gap, sealing it with a practiced gesture that speaks of repetition rather than creativity. This small repair, insignificant in appearance, is part of the larger unending battle against winter, a battle fought not with sweeping actions, but with hundreds of small interventions like this, plugging holes, tightening seams, sweeping frost off the inner walls before it melts and dampens the bedding. You follow him outside for a moment, stepping into the hard brightness of the morning where the snow gleams in a pale shimmer that almost hurts your eyes. The cabin's exterior looks even rougher in daylight than it did last night. Logs irregular in shape, seams uneven, corners not quite square, yet it stands with a stubborn dignity, a structure made not by artisans but by people who built with urgency, desperation, and whatever tools they carried across miles of wilderness. He runs his gloved hand along the wall, checking for new cracks caused by shrinking wood, because settlers knew that winter reshaped a cabin daily, squeezing it tighter, pulling it apart, demanding constant attention. Nearby, the sound of chopping wood continues with rhythmic certainty, each strike of the axe echoing across the frozen settlement, like a slow drumbeat announcing that life persists here. The woodpile shrinks faster in winter than any settler ever expects, and the man splitting logs knows that every piece he chops this morning will be burned before long. Few chores carry such immediate consequence as chopping wood, because the difference between a plentiful stack and a meagre one often determined whether nighttime cold would be merely uncomfortable or genuinely dangerous. A woman emerges from a neighboring cabin carrying a small wooden pail, her breath rising in soft clouds as she walks toward the creek, her boots crunching through the fresh layer of snow. Settlers often made this journey multiple times a day, breaking and re-breaking ice to access water that steamed faintly in the pot, but froze again within minutes once removed from the fire. Water had to be taken inside immediately, used quickly and never wasted, because once darkness returned, the creek would shift again into a solid sheet that resisted even the sharpest tools. You follow her inside her cabin for a moment, noticing how similar it is to the one you awoke in. Same rough logs, same patchworked quilts, same smoky scent lingering on every surface, but the details shift slightly from home to home. A row of herbs drying along a beam, a handmade broom leaning against the hearth, a pair of snow-crusted mittens pinned near the fire to thaw. Each cabin, though built from the same simple materials, contains its own quiet story of survival, expressed through the arrangement of tools, the color of the quilts, the pattern of wear on the floors. Back outside, the settlement begins to hum subtly with the activities of the day. Someone is repairing a sled runner with a heated nail, another is tightening the leather straps on a harness stiffened by the cold, and a pair of children are tasked with shaking out the straw bedding from the night, spreading it outside to air before bringing it back in later, each handful releasing tiny motes of frost into the sunlight. These chores, though mundane, are stitched into the fabric of winter life. Everyone participates, from the youngest to the oldest, because even the smallest efforts help counter the season's relentless weight. You walk toward the edge of the settlement, where the land stretches outward into a vast white openness dotted with scrubby bushes and distant tree lines. The snow reflects so much light that your eyes narrow instinctively, and you feel the cold seep through your boots in slow creeping rivers, climbing upward even as you move. Settlers often ventured out during these hours to check trap lines, gather fallen branches, or search for signs of game, but they never strayed too far. Not in winter, not when storms could appear without warning and erase every path home. As you turn back toward the cabins, their chimneys sending up lazy, curling threads of smoke, you feel a sudden awareness of how fragile and determined this cluster of lives truly is, each dwelling a small island of heat in a frozen world, each family bound together not only by blood or companionship, but by the shared necessity of enduring a season that tests every limb, every plan, every ounce of resolve. Inside once more, you sit near the hearth where the fire burns brighter now, flames rising and falling with a slow, hypnotic grace. A pot of water is heating, its surface rippling gently, preparing for the midday tasks of cooking, cleaning, or soaking stiff cloth. People speak in soft, practical tones about what must be done before the sun lowers again, how far the men should travel to collect wood, whether new snow is coming, whether the animals have enough shelter for the night ahead. And as the warmth of the fire wraps itself around your legs like a heavy quilt, you begin to understand that the day on the frontier is not a respite from the night, but a preparation for it. That every log chopped, every seam patched, every pot of water boiled is a step towards surviving the next plunge into darkness. Winter never ceases. It only shifts shape, demanding steadfast attention from dawn until dusk. The sun rises higher, though higher is a generous word in winter. It hangs low and pale above the horizon, offering more moral support than warmth. Yet its presence changes the tone of the settlement in subtle but meaningful ways. Shadows shorten. The snow takes on a faint crystalline shimmer. The wind, though still sharp, no longer howls with the same lonely intensity it had during the night. As you stand in the doorway of the cabin, you feel the day beginning to pulse with purpose, as if the settlement itself knows it has only a few precious hours of workable light before winter reclaims everything again. You step outside, your breath forming steady plumes in the cold air, and walk toward a group of settlers gathered near a half-finished stack of logs. The men lift each log with a grunt of practiced effort, their movements sure even though the cold stiffens their fingers through thick gloves. They angle the logs carefully, creating a cross-hatched pattern that ensures snow will not collapse the pile too easily. Stacking wood is not just a chore, it is planning, insurance, a promise of heat banked for future nights. Each log represents time carved from the day and returned to the night as survival. Nearby, two older boys carry long branches stripped of twigs, dragging them across the snow toward a lean-to built beside the cabin. The lean-to is a place for drying wood that was gathered still green or damp. Even in winter, settlers scavenged whenever possible because leaving wood unused felt like tempting fate. Some branches give off a faint scent of sap as they thaw near the cabin, a smell that mingles with smoke and frost, a quiet reminder that life persists even in the coldest season. At the far side of the settlement, a woman kneels beside a set of wooden traps she keeps near the tree line. She works silently, checking each one with a purposeful calm, brushing snow from their surfaces and resetting mechanisms stiffened by ice. Small game, rabbits, grouse, even the occasional fox could mean the difference between a tolerable winter and one where rations had to be stretched dangerously thin. When she finds a trap sprung but empty, she sighs softly, then clears the snow around it and repositions it with meticulous care. Winter demands patience as much as strength. Walking back toward the cabin, you pass a man repairing a broken sled runner. He heats a metal strap over a small fire, pressing it against the curve of the wood until the steam rises and the fibers relax. A well-maintained sled is as valuable as a horse in winter, capable of hauling firewood, transporting supplies, or even carrying an injured settler across miles of frozen ground. The man works with a slow, steady confidence, the kind born from necessity rather than hobbies. On the frontier, you don't perfect skills, you acquire them as soon as they become essential. Inside the cabin, soft voices drift from the hearth. A young girl sits cross-legged on the floor, carefully sorting dried beans from a sack stored near the wall. She moves with quiet concentration, separating cracked beans from whole ones, because waste is an enemy on the frontier. Nearby, a mother checks a row of jars sealed with wax, each filled with last summer's harvest, berries, pickled vegetables, dried corn kernels stored in tightly wrapped cloth. Winter reveals which choices were wise and which were hopeful but misguided. You kneel beside the fire, warming your hands, and find a man preparing a pot for midday stew. Into it he adds a handful of beans, a pinch of salt traded months ago in a distant town, and a piece of salted meat that had been dried carefully long before frost touched the ground. The aroma that rises as the pot begins to simmer is modest, almost humble, but in winter even modest food feels generous. Settlers did not eat extravagantly. They ate purposefully, always mindful that the stores they use today must last until spring. The cabin door opens briefly, letting in a gust of cold that makes the quilts flutter. A young boy enters with a bucket of fresh snow heaped nearly to the brim. Not for play, for melting. Snow is water, and water is life. He sets the bucket beside the hearth, where the heat will slowly transform it into something drinkable. Some families melted snow daily, some only in emergencies, but every household knew that winter could cut off access to streams in an instant. While the snow melts, the family tends to tools lined up on a low shelf, A saw with teeth dulled by weeks of use, a mallet with a splintering handle, knives that need fresh edges honed carefully against whetstones. Tools are not possessions here, they are lifelines. A broken blade or a damaged handle is more than an inconvenience. It is a breach in the fragile defense the settlers maintain against winter's demands. Repairing tools is a ritual, an affirmation that the next task can be completed. The next day can be met with readiness rather than fear. As the stew begins to bubble softly, the cabin fills with warmth that spreads from the fire outward, softening the stiffness in everyone's shoulders. People gather bowls and wooden spoons, their movements slow but assured. Mealtime is brief, but it carries an unspoken reverence, the knowledge that every ingredient has been earned through labor, preserved with care and rationed wisely. After they eat, the settlers sit quietly for a few moments, letting digestion warm them from within. You sense the room relax, not in luxury but in temporary relief. Yet even now, thoughts drift inevitably toward the evening ahead. There will be more wood to gather, more cracks in the walls to seal, more straw to arrange beneath the bedding. Winter's rhythm is circular, and the settlers have learned to move with it rather than resist. Someone glances toward the window again, gauging the sky, reading the color of the light like a message. A faint haze in the distance suggests more snow by sunset. No one panics, no one complains. Instead, people rise quietly, gather their coats and prepare for the next round of chores. Because on the frontier, endurance is not a single act. It is a chain of decisions carried out hour after hour, day after frozen day, in a world where survival is achieved not by conquering winter but by understanding it intimately. As the afternoon deepens, you feel the light begin its gradual retreat, a subtle dimming that frontier families never ignore, even when the sun still hangs above the treetops, even when its pale glow still reaches the snow-covered ground. Everyone senses the turning of the day toward night, and with that turning comes a quiet urgency. The settlement shifts once more from work to preparation, from outward tasks to inward defenses, all of them guided by the same unspoken truth. Winter nights are long, cold, and unforgiving, and every hour of daylight must be used to soften their bite. You step outside one final time, sensing how the air has grown sharper again, the wind carrying a thin whistle that reminds you of the night before, its hunger, its patience. Settlers move briskly now. The man at the woodpile gathers the last of the chopped logs, stacking them near the cabin door so no one will have to venture far during the night to feed the fire. The woman who tended her traps bundles the day's modest catch and returns home brushing snow from her sleeves, already planning how to stretch these small gains across the coming meals. Children gather armfuls of straw and dried grass for bedding, tugging them inside before frost can creep into the fibers. Inside the cabin, the fire is stoked higher than it has been all day, flames rising in a fierce orange bloom that fills the room with a warmth both physical and psychological. The pot that once held stew now hangs cleaned and drying near the hearth, while cups and wooden spoons rest beside it, ready for the next meal. Quilts have been shaken out, hides spread neatly across the straw mattress, layers arranged with thoughtful care so they can trap as much heat as possible once darkness falls. A few final repairs are made, a loose log seam tightened with fresh moss, a shutter reinforced with another strip of cloth, a creaking hinge warmed with tallow so it will not freeze in place. Outside, the sky blushes briefly with the rose and violet tones of an early frontier sunset, colors that make the snow glow faintly, as though lit from within, before slipping behind a curtain of blue-grey shadow. The temperature drops with startling speed. You feel it in your bones, a sinking chill that has nothing theatrical about it. It is simply winter reclaiming its dominance. Settlers hurry through the last of their tasks, animals fed, water hauled, embers stirred and tested. A dog trots into the cabin and curls itself near the hearth without being asked, its body offering warmth as naturally as any blanket. As darkness takes hold, the cabin door is shut firmly. the quilts layered over it trembling slightly as the wind resumes its nightly probing. Inside, the glow of the fire becomes the room's heartbeat, steady, warm, alive. People begin settling into their sleeping arrangements, sliding under the quilts and hides they prepared earlier, adjusting the layers with an intimacy born of repetition. Someone hums a quiet tune, an old melody passed from family to family, meant as much to soothe children as to keep adults alert while tending the fire through the early hours. You lie down again on the straw mattress, the familiar crackle greeting your weight. The buffalo robe drapes across your chest, heavy and reassuring. The warmth beneath it gathers slowly, almost shyly, but once it takes hold, it begins to build into a cocoon that shields you from the frost creeping along the walls. The air around your face grows cold enough to mist your breath, but your body remains protected, wrapped in the layered wisdom of those who lived in these harsh lands long before central heating made such resilience easy to forget. As sleep inches closer, you listen to the sounds of the cabin, the soft breathing of those beside you, the faint settling of logs in the fire, the distant moan of wind pressing against the walls, and you realize that everything you've witnessed today is part of a cycle as old as settlement itself. A cycle of cold and warmth, danger and shelter, effort and rest. Early settlers did not survive freezing winters through strength alone, but through rhythm, patience, and the shared knowledge that no one endures such a season by themselves. You close your eyes and feel the weight of the hide, the warmth of the bodies near you, the promise of the fire's glow, and you understand why people here, despite the hardship, despite the cold, despite the isolation, chose to stay. Winter would test them again and again, but each night survived was a victory carved from the frozen world, a quiet triumph whispered into the dark. And as the fire burns steadily and the first long breath of sleep pulls you downward, you enter the night the same way the settlers always did, wrapped in warmth they made with their own hands, trusting the cabin to hold, trusting the coals to last, trusting each other to greet the dawn. The story rests now, but winter continues, waiting for the next night and the next fire and the next quiet resilience.